So today, inshallah, we're going to continue from where we left off, and that is, I had mentioned 2 weeks ago that the primary proof of Islam is the concept of the Fitrah. And today I'm going to elaborate on that concept and explain the role of the Fitrah and how it proves the truth of Islam. How does the Fitrah prove the truth of Islam? But before I go there, very quickly, what is the linguistic definition of Fitrah? Raise your hand. What is the linguistic meaning of Fitrah? Raise your hand. Linguistic. Yes, corner. Okay, so it comes from the root fatara, which is to cleave open. Okay, so Fitrah then would mean something that is embedded, something that is deep inside. Okay, so that's the linguistic meaning of Fitrah. What is the technical meaning? Like, what does the Fitrah indicate in the Quran and the Sunnah? Who can define that? Sisters, define the Fitrah. What is the Fitrah? Like, not all at once. Sisters. Sisters. What is the Fitrah? I'm going to have to go back to the brothers then. Try to... Yes, go ahead. You were saying? Who was speaking? Yeah. I'm asking of definition, not role. Yes, sister in the back. So our innate nature, okay, that is one way to define it. Other definitions? A predisposition, okay. The same brother that defined linguistically. How do you define it? Moral compass is also its role. Moral compass also its role. So, okay, let me put it to you this way. What is the difference between the soul, the ruh, and the fitrah? What is the difference between the soul? In the Quran, we have the concept of ruh and the fitrah. Let me put it to you that way. Anybody want to venture a guess? Yes. So the fitrah is embedded into the soul. Okay, fair enough, but you still haven't defined the fitrah. Fair enough, that's valid, that's true. So the soul and the fitrah are two separate concepts. They're not synonymous, okay? They're not synonymous, but the soul is inside the fitrah is inside the soul. Okay, fair enough. But then move on, yeah. Jayed. So now we're getting better. This is more precise now. So I'm gonna add a few words here, but that's essentially correct. The soul is the life that Allah breathes into the lifeless corpse of ours, which makes it alive. The soul, the ruh, is what allows the corporeal body, the material body, to become a living entity. That is the soul. Without the soul, there is no life. And death is the best indication of the body without the soul. At the time of death, you have a body that is not alive. What is missing? 1 minute, the body was breathing and alive. The next minute, it's not. What has changed? The soul has exited the body. That is death. Okay? So the soul is what makes the body alive. Now, just like the body has a beating heart, and the body is more than the heart, so too the soul has the equivalent, and that is the fitrah. So the fitrah is the heartbeat of the soul. Or you can say, because here's where we don't know, it's mystery. It's ilm al-ghayb, because the soul itself is a part of ilm al-ghayb. Allah says in the Quran, they ask you about the soul. They ask you, what is the soul? Say to them, the soul is from the affairs of Allah, the command of Allah, the world of Allah. And that's so true. Can we prove the soul scientifically? Can we prove the soul scientifically? Yes or no? No. We cannot prove the soul scientifically. And yet everybody knows the soul exists. Even non-Muslim cultures, by and large, affirm the soul. Right? You can't even prove the existence of a soul in spite of all of our technological advancements, because the soul is from ilm al-ghayb. So a part of the soul, this is definitely beyond our knowledge and pay grade, is the fitrah. Now the fitrah then, You can say it's like the heart of the soul, or I also like to say, and again, all of this is like theories that we can't really prove. It's just my own interpretation after thinking about this topic for quite literally 20 years. So I have my own views and phrasing to say it. One way I would like to phrase it, and it's a theory, Allah knows ilm al-ghayb, this is ilm al-ghayb, Allah knows that reality. The fitrah is the intellect of the ruh. And I like that better than saying the fitrah is the qalb of the ruh. Why do I say this? Because, listen to this carefully, there are people who are alive physically, but mentally and spiritually they're not normal. They're on the abnormal scale. So they have a ruh, but they don't have cognitive function. What does that mean about their fitrah? Most likely they also don't have a fitrah. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Mentally challenged people, right? They're physically alive and also they're living bodies, but they're not mentally normal. So what does that mean about their intellect? It's not normal. What does that mean about their fitrah? Also most likely not normal. They're just not there fully. So the soul can be there without the brain of the soul, just like the body can be there without the brain functioning and the body is there. You guys following me, right? The default, your body has a qalb and a brain. Similarly, the default, the ruh, also has the fitrah embedded in it. But it is possible in exceptional cases to have the soul without the ruh, just like you can have the body without a functioning brain or normal brain. Is that clear? Right? So I like to think of the fitrah as the brains, the cognitive function of the ruh. And we're going to come back to this point. So understand, therefore, the fitrah is not a passive faculty. The fitrah has an independent thought process other than the brain. So we have two mechanisms of thinking. We have the intellectual thought, and then we have an intuition. We have a gut instinct of right and wrong. We have something that transcends the intellect, something that it's visceral to us, it's deeply embedded in us. An intuition that knows something is right or something is wrong. Where does that intuition come from? That is the brains of the ruh. That is the fitrah. Is that clear? Right? So that's the definitions here. Okay. So, some more facts about the fitrah. And this is stuff that is relatively difficult to find in books, the way that I'm presenting it, because this is research that I myself have done. Of course, I'm not saying it doesn't exist elsewhere, but the way that it's being collated and collected and being presented to you, generally speaking, I don't think you'd find it in this type of mechanism, because this is a topic that I myself did as a part of my PhD, and I'm still writing papers on it. FYI, I just had a paper proposal accepted to a book that's going to be coming out from Cambridge, and it's going to be about Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemological role of the fitrah. So I'm going to be elaborating even more in this regard. So this is like, inshallah, stuff that you might not find in this simple matter in other lectures or writings. So, some more information about the fitrah. We proved the fitrah exists via the Quran and Sunnah, correct? Everybody correct? Right? Yes? Okay. I'm not going to quiz you. You should all know. How many verses reference the fitrah? How many verses reference the fitrah? 0? La ilaha illallah. It's literally in the Quran. Fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nasa alayha is but one. There are others that are indirect, but this is the most explicit. So when I say how many verses, the intelligent should have asked, do you mean explicit or implicit? If explicit, then 1. If implicit, well, then the sky is the limit. There's a lot of concepts that the Quran mentions. Okay? And hadith as well. There are many hadith about the fitrah. Okay. Question. Can we infer the existence of the fitrah outside of the Quran and Sunnah? If we didn't have the Quran and Sunnah, are there other indications that the fitrah exists? Do you understand the question? Let's remove the sacred texts. Can we infer the existence of the fitrah via observed, lived, experiential reality. Yes or no? Sisters are very silent. Make us its judgment. If you're right or wrong, at least show us some confidence. Yes. Majority say yes. Brothers? Yes. Okay. Yes, it is the correct answer. Yes. How do we prove the existence of the fitrah outside of the Quran and Sunnah? I will give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7, not exhaustive, but 7 points. I'll give you 7 points. Number 1, the historical and biological reality that mankind as a whole believes in that which is beyond the physical realm. Religiosity, spirituality, belief in a higher power. All societies pre-modernity, without exception, have been religious societies. Every single one of them. We're going to come to this later on in our class. Atheism is a very, very modern phenomenon. By very modern, I mean the last 150 years old. No human being before 150 years ago was an avowed atheist the way that we understand atheism. Atheism, a rejection in the belief of a higher power, simply did not exist in pre-modernity. I know it sounds confusing to many of you. We're going to come back to this point here. All societies, all intellectuals, all humans affirm belief in a higher power or more than one higher power. All civilizations had religion. The fact that there is religion, even though the world doesn't necessarily need religion, indicates there is something that is beyond the material. So, a natural belief in a higher power. Biologically, scientists, psychologists have proven that children are born predisposed to believe in the existence of a higher power. This is something that multiple child psychologists have demonstrated and shown, that children innately believe that there is a higher being. Call it Allah, call it God, call it Jesus, whatever you want to call it. But the notion of a creator is embedded even in children that are raised in a-religious, irreligious, non-religious households. Where does it come from? The fitrah. Number 2, the fact that we are not just a conglomerate collection of atoms and of chemical reactions, that we desire to know the truth, that we wish to search for meaning in our lives. And even, Plato and Aristotle, they talk about this reality. Aristotle has the notion of man having a telos. There's an end goal. You want to know your place in society. You want to know your place in the world. What are we doing here? What is being? One of the common questions of Western, Western philosophy is, what does it mean to be, right? When Shakespeare asks to be or not to be, he's actually kind of getting to this point here. What does it mean to exist? What is the meaning? Now, question. If we were simply biological accidents, why are we concerned about the meaning of life rather than just being concerned about living? The fact that we are getting involved in the metaphysical, desiring truth, wanting to know reality, where is this coming from? It is the fitrah's yearning to discover and be discovered. It is the fitrah's mind's curiosity, right? The soul's minds, I should say. The soul wants to discover why is it here, and that is the yearning. Number 3, to live life beyond materialism. So number 2 is to search for higher meaning, and number 3, to accomplish in one's life more than just physical happiness. Once you reach a certain age, in fact, frankly, even teenagers, but I mean, it's understandable. Teenagers, maybe it's difficult for them to move beyond, when they're 14, 15, 16, they're just interested in, having fun and TikTok videos, whatever it might be. But the reality is, even at that stage, intelligent amongst them, and definitely when you become older, every human being without exception aspires to achieve something more than just mere banality of existence. Nobody just wants to live and eat and sleep and procreate and have fun, after a while, that becomes meaningless and boring. And you want to do something bigger. But if you were just a biological accident, why? So yearning not just for answers, but for actual nobility in existence. It is a manifestation of the fitrah. Number four, the soul's need to be nourished and sustained and paid attention. Ibn Taymiyyah writes, the nourishment of the soul is more important for human happiness than the nourishment of the body. That's very profound. The nourishment of the soul is more important for satisfaction in life than the nourishment of the body. Because even if the body is not fed, but the soul is fed, the soul will feel accomplished. Simple reality of Ramadan and fasting Ramadan. And when the body is fed, but the soul is not fed, then the soul does not have purpose and meaning in existence. So the reality of the soul wanting to be nourished and sustained, number four. Number five, a manifestation of the existence of the fitrah, basic, universal, general, agreed upon morality. Why does mankind from east to west understand that elderly parents, once they cease to be of functional use to society, should not just be discarded and left at the side of the road? There is a universal sense of obligation to take care of. Why does society universally acknowledge that stealing is wrong? The strong should not take from the weak, even though that is the law of the jungle. But in our humanity, it is not law in any society. Even the one who does it would not like it to be done to him, because they know this is unjust. So the broad aspects of morality are actually agreed upon. And this is referenced in the Quran. You can say this is a reference also to the fitrah indirectly. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. Allah inspired the soul with the knowledge of evil and the knowledge of good. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. Allah Azza wa Jal inspired the soul with the knowledge of fujur, what is evil, and taqwa, good. Everybody on earth recognizes that when you see an orphan, not related to you, no biological ties, and you are generous to that orphan, you give food to the hungry, everybody recognizes that is nobility. But why? Why? Where is that notion of this being good comes from? Everybody recognizes that lying and cheating is ignoble. Why? Where is this coming from? Universal concept of morality, agreed upon morality. This is number five. Number six, a corollary of number five, and this is a profound point here, and it also goes back to number four, but I'm rephrasing it in a different way. The feeling of spiritual satisfaction when performing acts of good, coupled with the feeling of shame when committing acts of evil. Understand this point? We all, like a mass murderer in court, the default, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but the default is that they are embarrassed at what they've done. They don't want to be seen. How many times they catch a criminal, and even as they're walking into the court, they're going to shield their faces from the camera because they're embarrassed at having done a crime. Where does this embarrassment and shame come from? Conversely, we feel a sense of nobility and fulfillment when we do good. Why do we feel good when we do good? When we give charity, we feel a sense of accomplishment. Nobody has seen us. We're stopping at the traffic light. We see a hungry man, pull the window down, give them $5, go on. Nobody has seen us. For the rest of the day, there's a bit of happiness in our hearts. We've done something good. But why? Where did that feeling? Because what we've done is we've nourished the soul. And when we nourish the soul feels alive. Just like when we have a meal, the body feels alive. When we nourish the soul feels alive. And one can say this is in the Quran, an-nafs al-mutma'inna versus an-nafs al-lawwama. Okay, an-nafs al-mutma'inna versus an-nafs al-lawwama. So the concept, therefore, of the soul, you can also add here, the final point, you can, similar to this, is the notion of what we call in English conscience. Conscience, having a conscience, which is something doesn't make sense if we're just a bunch of random atoms put together. So, to summarize, therefore, the existence of the fitrah is manifested in multiple levels. And it can be demonstrated that man is more than just the collection of atoms and particles. There's something about man that makes man different than animal. And it cannot be explained scientifically or biologically. And this is where the fitrah comes in. So the fitrah is manifested, one could say very simplistically, in the humanity of being human. It's what it means to be human. Because the animals don't have fitrah the way we have fitrah. The animals don't have, this is a human concept that Allah has given unto us. So, we've answered therefore the question that can the fitrah be proven to exist beyond the Quran and Sunnah? And the answer is yes, and I explained how. We now move on to the next question, and that is, okay, so the fitrah is the brains of the soul, as I said, and you have the intellectual brains of the body. So now let's get to the next question. What information does the fitrah convey that is separate and distinct from the brains of the body? And what does the brain convey that is separate and distinct from the fitrah? And what is the relationship between these two intellectual cores, the bodily intellect and the spiritual intellect? Do you understand the question? Do you understand the question? Or should I repeat the question? I am saying it appears that we have two intellectual faculties, two brains. I don't like using the term brains, but I'm being a bit simplistic here. Okay? Two faculties of tadabbur. Two faculties of cognition. Let's put it that way. Okay? The one of them is spiritual and the other is physical. Clear? Guys, why is there no ta'awun? Where? Have you had heavy biryani now? What's going on here? Huh? It's all clear. Okay. So, my question to you then, what does the fitrah convey to us in terms of knowledge that we don't need the brain for? The physical brain. And what does the brain convey that the fitrah could not convey? And is there ever a clash? And is there ever an overlap? This is the question. It's a very difficult question. And the problem is we have to glean the answers because we don't have explicit, detailed expositions in this regard. We have to kind of sort of figure it out with the generalities that we have. So, again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize for you the research I've done. I would say the fitrah conveys, at the very least, 6 distinct areas of knowledge that are deeply embedded in the psyche of man and do not need complex rational proofs to prove. The fitrah conveys at least six areas of knowledge. I'm not saying 6 facts, that's a bit too simple. 6 areas of knowledge. The first of them, transcendental meaning. Don't get confused with the words. This goes back to what I'm talking about 5 minutes ago. The yearning for a higher purpose. That curiosity comes from the fitrah, not the brain. You want to know the truth. You want to discover, what am I doing here? And that is primarily the fitrah's curiosity. The brain will follow, but it starts from the fitrah. So, transcendental meaning, a higher level of spirituality, a yearning for a noble cause. You're searching for the truth. That curiosity is coming from the fitrah. Number 2, the fitrah will give us, without the need for deep contemplation, the fact that there is a higher power that created us. The existence of God is deeply embedded in the human psyche and does not need complex proofs. This is a fundamental aspect of theology according to one school of Islam, and that is the Taymiyyah school, Ibn Taymiyyah. Other schools would not phrase it in this manner, but I am coming to you from the Taymiyyah paradigm overall in this regard, and I am a strong advocate of this. You don't need complicated proofs to prove Allah's existence when the fitrah has already given you His existence on a silver platter. Your soul, your psyche, your intellectual brains of the ruh automatically gives you this fact. And your brains of the body does not need to function at a high level to know this fact. It could function, it's not gonna, but it doesn't need to. Because intuitively, as Ibn Taymiyyah says, how do you require proofs for a creator when everything around you is a proof of the creator? And in fact, your attempt to find proof is itself a proof. Your curiosity, your brain, your intellect is itself a proof. So how do you want me to find a proof when everything around you is a proof and your curiosity is a proof and the brains you're using to find it is a proof? Where do I need to go outside to find when the proof is all around me and inside of me? So the fitrah automatically conveys to you, number two, there is a God. And therefore, we're going to come back to this point multiple times. Again, there's going to be some overlap in this class, but inshallah, memorize these templates, and every time we do something more, it'll fit in perfectly. I am not of those who believe that one needs to go down the road of philosophical proofs for the existence of God with atheists. I don't believe this. And I believe that this attempt will always fail. Hardly any philosopher has converted to religion because of these complex proofs. Hardly any philosopher has converted to any religion based upon a detailed discussion of the proofs of the existence of God by some theologian, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Christian, whether they're Jew. It just, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Because the problem is not intellectual, the problem is spiritual. Rejecting God is not an intellectual problem, it is theological, spiritual arrogance. Rejecting God doesn't stem that the brain doesn't add up. Rejecting God is that you covered the brain of the ruh, which is covering the fitrah, which is exactly what kufr or the kafir means. Kufr is the covering up. Okay? So, the second point, the fitrah teaches us the existence of God. The third point, the fitrah teaches us not only the existence of God, but that God is one. So the fitrah automatically tells us there must be one supreme being. And that is why every single religion in all of human history at some level is monotheistic. No religion is fully polytheistic. Some religions are partially polytheistic. No religion is fully polytheistic. Even Hinduism believes in one ultimate God, and then a triune of three very powerful gods, and then a plethora of many millions of demigods. At some level, every religion believes in one ultimate God. The fitrah cannot affirm multiple, co-equal, co-powerful pantheon of gods. The ancient Greeks, they had their Zeus. The ancient Romans, they had their Jupiter. And everybody comes under Zeus, under Jupiter. The Jahili Arabs, they believed in Allah. And then under, they had Allat and Al-Uzza and Manat, not equal to Allah. Min dunillah, the Quran always says, right? وَاتَّخَذُوا مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ آلِهَةً. They took gods under Allah, not along with Allah. Even the Quraysh did not believe in gods with Allah. Nobody did this. No creation in human history. You will say, but how about the Zoroastrians, if you know their theology? How about the Manichaeans? And we say, even they. This is not fully the same. Yes, they do affirm two powerful gods, but eventually one God wins over the other. The God of good wins over the God of evil. They're not fully equal. Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda, the God of good, represented by fire. Ahriman, the God of evil, represented by darkness. So, according to them, there are two powerful gods. Yes, they do say this. They're the only religion that actually even says this. There are two powerful gods. And the God of good creates good, the God of evil creates evil. But even in their theology, eventually the one God will win over the other God, eliminate the other God, and then there will be nothing but peace on earth. That will be judgment, or that will be qiyamah, that will be the end. They're not fully equal. Because the fitrah does not allow the affirmation of co-equal, co-powerful gods at all. So the fitrah affirms there is God, the fitrah affirms there is one God. Clear? Okay, next point, the fitrah. What else does the fitrah affirm? So the fitrah affirms there is the existence of a God. Well, so the fitrah affirms it wants to know about God. Then it affirms the existence of God. Then it affirms God is one. That's three things. Number 4, what can the fitrah tell us about God? Tell me. What can the fitrah tell us? Human nature, cognition. God is powerful. Very good. No religion says my God is a weak God. What else? All-knowing. What else? God wants good for us. Make it even broader than that. What else? God is merciful, compassionate. We see mercy around the creation. What else? Transcendent. We're getting, that's another point. That's valid. So one can say the fitrah automatically affirms that God has noble attributes. And that's why all religions affirm a God that is good and noble, a God that is all-knowing. Does any religion say, oh, my God is weak? Does any religion say, my God doesn't know? All religions affirm a God that has attributes of perfection. True, if you have a pantheon of gods, sometimes some of the gods have negative attributes, but the ultimate God always has all the positive attributes. The fitrah affirms this. So the fitrah affirms that God has divine attributes that are praiseworthy. That is number 4. Number 5 is what our brother said, and that is the fitrah wants a connection with this God. The fitrah yearns for some type of connection. And that connection is established via rituals, via worship, via servitude, by praising God, by submitting to God. Allah says in the Quran, for every nation we have appointed rituals so that they may mention the name of Allah. This is in the Quran. لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ جَعَلْنَا مَنْسَكًا لِيَذْكُرُوا اسْمَ اللَّهِ. For every nation, we have appointed rituals. So there are mansak, there are rituals for every single civilization. No civilization has ever had no rituals. And in fact, if you go back on Earth, the oldest, human remains and whatnot, you typically find temples, you typically find altars, you typically find rituals they would do. Why are they doing rituals? Because the fitrah yearns for that connection. And finding comfort in worshipping God is something that stems from the fitrah. So this is point number 5. Whoever that God is, even if it's a false God, worshipping a false God will bring you more comfort than not worshipping any God. Worshipping a false God with false rituals is feeding the fitrah something, which is better than not feeding the fitrah at all. It's like, for lack of a better term, feeding somebody just cake and candy and sweets. Very unhealthy. Imagine that's all they ate. Very unhealthy, but it is better than starving to death. So a fitrah that is worshipping incorrectly is infinitely better than a fitrah that is not worshipping at all. Okay, so this is point number 5. And then point number 6, again, we go back to what I said a few minutes ago, of the knowledge that the fitrah conveys is a knowledge of basic morality. I already mentioned this in 10 minutes ago. Fitrah tells us that certain things are good and certain things are not good. Sorry to be explicit here, but you're all adults here. We see this constantly in the current climate we find ourselves when it comes to the areas of fahisha, of public fahisha and nudity, of the reality of the porn industry and whatnot. All the time, this reality of the fitrah, knowing something to be wrong, you can't even explain why, but you know it is wrong. The phenomenon of, the porn culture, of OnlyFans, of all of this and that, people are embarrassed and ashamed to admit this. And when they're challenged in public, some of these people that are performers, even if they try to justify it, the rhetoric back and forth, and I've seen a bit of this dialogue online and whatnot, would your father be proud? What are you going to tell your children, etc., etc.? And these people that are performers, that are earning a lot of money, they pretend they like it. Deep down inside, sometimes they walk off the set, sometimes they cry, and you can tell they're very embarrassed or nervous in this regard. And almost every single one of these performers that has been honest has eventually come back and said, I made the biggest mistake, we shouldn't have done this. But why? The fitrah. The fitrah is telling them this is not right, it's not noble, it's not healthy, it's not good. Even if their tongue attempts to justify, even if their minds can find mathematical arguments for capitalism and whatnot, the fitrah tells them this is disgusting and immoral. And that knowledge is embedded in the psyche. You can't really prove it intellectually that easily. Supply and demand capitalism, you would be able to justify anything. And that's why, if you want to, we're going to come to this actually, fourth wave feminism, post fourth wave feminism, one of the biggest realities of the contradiction of this trend is how post fourth wave feminism itself has divided sharply over sex work and over prostitution and over pornography. And amongst feminists themselves, there is a civil war going on. Large groups amongst them are correctly saying this is exploitation. And other groups are saying this is empowerment. And intellectually, both can make arguments intellectually. And this shows you the difference between the fitrah's arguments and the arguments of the intellectual body. Because the brain, if you remove the conscience and the fitrah, can easily make an argument for capitalist gain and for the benefit of money and whatnot, but deep down inside, everybody knows this is wrong. So the fitrah therefore teaches us basic universal morality. Jayyid. So these are 6 areas of the fitrah. Now we're going to get, if that wasn't complicated enough, now we're going to get a bit more complicated. You guys ready? But this is the end of the ride. Then inshallah we will open the floor for Q&A. There are 3 realities that are interacting with each other. It's quite complicated, but I need you to pay attention and then write it down later on. The first of them is the intellect, the physical brain. The second is the fitrah, the spiritual brain. And the third is Allah's revelation, the Qur'an. So far so clear? That's very easy. There are 3 separate realities. These 3 realities in the paradigm of Ibn Taymiyyah, the epistemology of Ibn Taymiyyah, and it is that epistemology that I am very much sympathetic to and I am a firm believer in as well. In the paradigm of Ibn Taymiyyah, these 3, in an ideal situation, are working in harmony, in sync. They have formed a beautiful, cohesive bond, each one of which is supporting the other. And there is never an actual conflict between the pure fitrah and the sound intellect and the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that clear? That should be very clear. Okay? In an ideal situation, in the life of a Muslim, the mind, the soul, and the Quran. Let me use the word soul for the fitrah. Okay? The mind is the body, the soul is the fitrah, and the Quran. The mind, the soul, and the Quran are in tandem, in harmony, overlap. Everything's great. And that is the purpose of revelation, to anchor the mind and the soul and to form a relationship of harmony. Only by wedding the mind and the soul to the Quran will this perfect union be formed. That's the easy part. No difficulty there. But what happens when one of these three is not in tandem? What happens when one of these three is not in sync with the others? And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So, to clarify, let's talk about some similarities and differences between the mind, the soul, and the revelation. The mind, knowledge of the brain. When you are born, does your brain have a pre-programmed knowledge already in it? The brain.
No.
You came out knowing your bachelor's degrees and your mathematics and science? The brain. Because what you want is the fitrah. The fitrah knows certain things. The brain, Allah says in the Quran, أخرجكم ببطون أمهاتكم لا تعلمون شيئا. You came out of your mother's wombs not knowing anything. You didn't even know 1 + 1 is 2. You had to learn that. You didn't know anything. So the knowledge of the brain is acquired. It is learned. It is extracted. It is obtained via examination. The knowledge of the fitrah, is it acquired? No. It's embedded. It's there. This is a significant difference. And of course, the knowledge of the Quran comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is divinely revealed. So, that's one level. Another level, the knowledge of the brain, by and large, it is extremely vast in scope. Once it starts to acquire knowledge, once it wants to learn something, it thinks it can go everywhere, even though, of course, in the real knowledge, it cannot go everywhere. In other words, the brain does not have limits on itself. And the brain, the mind, the intellect will attempt to extrapolate knowledge in all fields. Clear? Whether it is mathematics, whether it is science, whether it is biology, whether it is philosophy, whether it is ethics, whether it is law, whether it is metaphysics, the brain has no end in its perspective. Obviously, from our Muslim perspective, the brain has an end and it shouldn't go farther, but it still goes farther. Is that clear? That be clear? Guys? Yes? Okay. The fitrah, is its knowledge infinite? Compared to the brain, the fitrah is more than the brain? In terms of the quantity of knowledge it has, much less. In terms of the quantity of knowledge, the fitrah is much less. The fitrah does not know as much as the brain can acquire. Not when the child is born, but I'm saying the acquired knowledge. The fitrah is a small amount of knowledge, right? And in terms of the Quran, how about its knowledge? Its knowledge is a specific scope. Theology, ilm al-ghayb, rituals, specific scope. Okay. In terms of the certainty of knowledge, how certain is the knowledge of the fitrah? Pretty certain. Very certain. It is definitive. How about the brain? Not so certain. Especially in non-tangible, non-observable phenomenon. The brain is very finicky. Out of all the three, the certainty of knowledge of the brain is the least, even though its scope is the most. Does that make sense? Right? And of course, the knowledge of the Quran is infallible. Correct? The knowledge of the fitrah is fairly certain. The knowledge of the Quran is 100% yaqini. The knowledge of the brain is very finicky. So far so clear, right? Okay, given all of these parameters, now put all of the three together, and that will be the conclusion. Inshallah, we'll continue next week on the fitrah and then other things as well with regards to the fitrah. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, a pure fitrah will sense the truth and beauty of the Quran, of the revelation from Allah. And the fitrah will be attracted to the revelation like magnets attract. The fitrah will recognize the truth. Ibn Taymiyyah has this analogy. Like the eye recognizes light. When the light shines, the eye knows this is light. So the fitrah will recognize the truth of the Quran, the truth of Islam. There will be an attraction. Once the attraction is formed, the fitrah will then bring in the brain and say, hey, you need to look at this. This is too good to be true. Or maybe it is true. So the fitrah will trigger an intellectual exploration in the mind of the kafir. As for the Muslim is basically in harmony anyway. That's why, go back to my lecture 2 weeks ago, the Muslim is not required to exit Islam, examine Islam, then re-enter Islam. No, because all three are already in harmony. All three are in synthesis. All three are in a symbiotic relationship. So there's no need to exit because peace is achieved intrinsically. But according to Ibn Taymiyyah, and again, we would agree with this, even anecdotally, look at the converts, talk to their story, look at their stories, listen to their stories. Something about Islam appeals to them. And every convert has something different that appeals to that convert. Every single convert. Because what appeals to them is simply the trigger. Deep down inside, they don't even know it. It's not the one aspect that appealed to them. It is that their pure hearts are attracted to the purity of the Quran. It is that their fitrah recognizes the truth of Islam. And there's always a catalyst, and that's their conversion story. But that's just a catalyst. The actual chemical reaction, which maybe even the convert doesn't even recognize, is that the purity of the soul finds the purity of the Quran to be completely compatible. And so there's the bridge that develops, and then that soul brings in the brain. Hey, look at this. And if the soul is pure enough, then the brain will submit to the Quran. If the soul is pure enough, the brain will say, yes, this is true, and submit. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah argues, this is a very key point. Write it down for the 10% that are actually writing the other 90%. Anyway, let's talk about that later on. Okay. That's why you can't answer the questions I ask you. The brain will submit to the truth of the Quran when the fitrah is pure. And the brain will recognize as well after the fitrah has recognized, because the real submission is the submission of the soul. Once the soul submits, the brain will follow. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, once the brain submits, knowing the Quran to be true, after that, it should not challenge a specific issue of the Quran, because it knows the Quran is from Allah. And we're going to come back to this point. The brain's function is to validate the fitrah's intuition in a broad sense. Is the Quran from Allah? Is the Prophet ﷺ a prophet? And the brain will generically say, without a doubt, the Quran is from Allah. Generically, holistically, the Quran is from Allah. How else could this book be produced? The Prophet ﷺ is a prophet. There is no other explanation. Once the brain acknowledges and the fitrah knows, after this, there is complete submission to the Quran. Then, when a particular fact comes that the brain does not fully understand, at this stage, the brain does not have the right to reject a minutiae now that it has accepted the holistic truth of Islam. And the brain will have to say, Allahu A'lam, and I don't know. And that is in line with intelligence. The brain should recognize its own limits. We're going to come back to this point over and over again because there are many unanswered questions that I don't have answers to. Evolution is a simple example. I don't have a solid answer to it right now. I don't. I hope one day one of you guys do. I don't have an answer to it, but I'm still a Muslim. Why am I a Muslim? Because I recognize the Quran to be from Allah and the Prophet to be a prophet. The fact that I cannot answer one question, I humble my mind and I say, one day we'll know. But my soul is certain. So, finishing off here. So, the pure fitrah is attracted to the Quran and then brings in the intellect. Jayyid. What if the fitrah is not pure? What if the fitrah has been corrupted? Pause here. What corrupts the fitrah? The fitrah is corrupted by being exposed to false theologies and by willingly and knowingly feeding the soul immoralities to the point of it numbing the correct sensation. So, for example, a drug addict, if you give them pure food, they might not even want it anymore because they've corrupted their taste buds, if you like. Maybe a worldly example here, right? Most human beings would love good food. There are people out there, they have corrupted their bodies to the point of they don't want good food anymore. Similarly, the soul has a similar reality. There are people that have intentionally corrupted their souls, turned away from the purity, such that their fitrah is beyond redemption. So no matter how much they're exposed to the Quran, to the Sunnah, to the Seerah, their fitrah will never submit. When the fitrah does not submit, the brain will find an excuse to justify that lack of submission. The brain is not in the end the final arbiter. It is the secondary. It comes in. So if the fitrah submits, the intellect will also submit. And if the fitrah does not submit, then the intellect will find an excuse to say, this is why I didn't submit. And that's why, at its base, rejection of Allah is a spiritual disease, not an intellectual one. At its base, rejection of Islam is a spiritual one, not an intellectual one. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah says, if the fitrah is partially corrupted, not fully, then there is hope. But as I said last time, we do not know when we meet somebody whether their fitrah is only partially corrupted or fully, and we deal with them as if it's partially corrupted. Even the worst enemy of Islam might potentially one day have a salvageable fitrah, and this has happened multiple times. So we do not know, we don't pronounce a verdict in this world, and we try our best to present such that something in their hearts is attracted to the truth of Islam. So another reality will happen, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. You can have 5 minutes for Q&A. Actually, let's delay this to the end. That is, what do you do if the fitrah and the soul are having a debate between each other? What if the brain of the soul and the brain of the intellect is at odds? And it is possible. There are some areas, and one of the examples of this, frankly, is, I just gave you that example of aspects of morality. Aspects of morality where many people deep down inside, they just don't feel right about it, but then they've been programmed to say the politically correct things. And maybe even viscerally, they will not like certain things, but the brain and the tongue will say something else. That is where we need the Quran. Because the Quran, the wahy, is the ultimate anchor, the ultimate arbiter between the fitrah and the aql. Because the fitrah could be corrupted slightly or more. The aql is very finically, very, far from knowing certainty. So when the fitrah and the aql are not certain, this is when the Quran comes in and gives us absolute certainty. Okay, so quick questions. Is a woman's fitrah different from a man's fitrah? Not when it comes to theological knowledge and morality. Okay, it is exactly the same. Now, some would say, and this is an issue of there's no certainty here. Does the fitrah also give psychological characteristics? If it does, because that's an if it does, then in this realm, perhaps a man's soul and a woman's soul is different. But if we say, no, this is not the fitrah, this is something else, then we will say it's the same. For our purposes, we are looking at the fitrah theologically and morally. Without a doubt, in that sense, theologically and morally, the fitrah is exactly the same. If we assume the fitrah is the soul's intellect, does that mean that someone like Khidr, for example, had a great fitrah from birth? Or is this something that his body was blessed with knowledge later on? No, no, no. The fitrah is essentially the same in all human beings. If you want to see the fitrah manifested, look at the Prophet ﷺ in the first 40 years of his life. That is the fitrah. The fitrah manifested without the wahy is the Prophet ﷺ for the first 40 years. Believing in one God, worshipping one God, affirming morality, sitting in Ghar Hira, wanting to worship Allah, not knowing how to worship Allah. That's the fitrah, right? So the fitrah is pure. One could say, though, the fitrah of the Prophet ﷺ was never even tainted. That would never happen to any human being. The purity of the fitrah was absolutely preserved. Only the prophets can be to that level. Everybody else, their fitrah will be slightly tainted. So, question about what's going on in India and Pakistan and the hadith in this regard. 2 minutes left in this regard. Subhanallah, that's a very deep question. There are some hadith about Ghazwat Hind, and I have an hour-long lecture. You can listen to that. And I explained that even if the hadith are authentic, and they might be authentic, it appears that those hadith were talking about the first Ghazawat that took place in the time of the Sahaba, in the time of the early Umayyads, and that has already taken place. I do not view these traditions as being anything to do with our times at all. Obviously, our hearts are for those who believe in Allah and His Messenger. We make dua for them on all sides, and we hope that World War III is averted. But I don't consider those hadith to be applicable in our times. And as you know, I've said this multiple times that we should not link modern political events to hadith. That is a mistake. We do not read in a Hollywood script into what is happening around us. And with that, inshallah ta'ala, we have 1 minute left, so I want to pause here, and we will continue, inshallah, next week. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.